Yep, that looks like it's on. Okay, well, hi everyone. I think, well, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Dawn. I'm currently a lecturer in the School of Psychology. When we say School of Psychology, it's actually psychological science.
Wow,
but I've been working with
it's being renamed as we speak, right?
Not yet, so it's to be confirmed.
That's the fourth name that for me while I've been.
Yes, well, but I've been working with Steve for, I don't know, 5 years now, and used to be a postdoc in his lab. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is actually work that started as a student project that we've recently submitted to be published, actually. So it was last year's student project as well. So this is kind of where your projects can go, I guess. And so the context of this, I'll get my mouse working. Yes, thank you. Right, is that we have seen a very sustained and ongoing attack on all that progress we've made around, just as a society, around equalizing opportunities, affirmative action, increasing diversity of workforces and selection. Now, you might be familiar with some of these headlines. Sorry, I'm just going to minimize everyone online so people in the room can see the screen. Trouble with Zoom. And this is coming a lot from the US, which is driving a lot of the agenda. And some of the commonalities in these headlines, never mind, the first line just says President Trump, not very important, tends to use a particular sort of language. And so zooming in on this particular example, we can see that there's a ban on workforce balancing, which is essentially trying to meet certain quotas for certain groups, usually ones that have been discriminated against historically. And it's always discussed as being, this opposition is discussed as being protecting merit-based opportunity. So what then are we talking about here? So meritocracy is kind of, and this is actually the language of the Trump administration. So it says that every man and woman should have the opportunity to go as far as their hard work, individual initiative, and competence can take them. So it's very much rewards based on things that you do. And it's a very deeply held belief in the US. People believe it should underline all rewards, especially for jobs or indeed university selection. And actually, a lot of countries support this meritocracy principle as well. My own country, where I'm from, Singapore, it's almost like a fundamental system we're taught happens. But so in the US context, it is really strong because it's attached to this idea that you have the American dream. If you just work hard enough, you will reach success. So today, this talk is going to be looking more closely at this idea that, well, selection quotas or affirmative action is unmeritocratic. And I'm going to zoom in on gender quotas specifically. I'll get to the definition in a moment here. I'm going to start by examining the ideas that this is unmeritocratic, and I'm going to explain why it's a myth. And then after that, I'm going to walk you through the experimental attempts that we made to correct this myth, particularly among US Republican voters who believe strongly in meritocracy. So gender quotas are basically explicit constraints or mandates, so rules that say you have to hire or appoint a certain minimum share of men or women to a position or have them in a selection pool that you then pick from. So for example, it could be at least 40% women, or even just saying like 10% women. That's still a quota because you set a number basically. And you could obviously apply it for men as well. And you'll see some examples later in which we did find research that applied quotas to men. But the question we need to ask is this actually against this principle of merit? And so to do this, I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into what meritocracy actually aims to achieve. So let's say we've got a population here. So I'm going to simplify it and just go with, you're either a circle or a triangle. And I'm going to represent the level of talent these circles and triangles have using darker shades of colors. So the sort of deep purple means they're more talented, and the light gray means they're less talented. So what meritocracy means is that we should select people based on their talent. So in a perfect meritocracy, we would kind of pick all of the darkest shades, like those. Sorry, that line there just says meritocracy means we should always pick the most talented. But actually, we don't see this happening now. What tends to happen in most hiring processes or selection processes, whether it's universities, jobs, so on and so forth, politics, actually, US is a huge example of this right now, is that selections based on connections, or what we call legacy factors, who you know, who has power already, whose parents know somebody. So there's a tendency for one particular group that's already that in-group. So let's say in this example, it's the circles. They will tend to recruit other circles, even if those circles aren't as talented. And maybe they might get one triangle that they happen to know. So there's an interesting paper there that actually looked at the influence of legacy factors when it came to admissions in US universities and shows that this is actually going on. So what quotas do is reverse that process. So if you implement a 40% quota for triangles now, this encourages the mediocre circles to be replaced by talented triangles. So you keep the best circles. They're not going to go anywhere because you can still have sort of, I mean, I don't know if my maths is completely correct there, but 40% quotas means you can still keep about 4 circles, but then you have to go out and find triangles to meet your quota. And what tends to happen is that the talented triangles replace the mediocre circles. And so your net outcome is that your overall talented level increases because you have recruited more talent to replace the untalented people. But an interesting thing we see is that if you just look at the circles, the average talent of those circles, which is the non-quota group, is also increasing because you have kicked out the mediocre legacy candidates. So that is basically removing privilege from people who should not have had privilege anymore. Therefore, you end up with a meritocratic outcome and you get the best people. And so that's the theory of it, that's the logic. There's also empirical findings that do back it up, showing that gender quotas tend to either maintain the overall quality of candidates, meaning you already had the best, so nothing changes, or in many cases, it actually raises it using the process I just explained. So here are some of the findings that show that candidate quality stays high. So a lot was done in politics, including in the UK, showing that women selected using all women shortlists in the UK elections. This was, I think they were looking at the I can't remember. It might have been either the 1997 or the 2010 one. Was there an election in 2010? Yes, there was. So showing that they were actually equally qualified as the non-quota women. In Spain, we see this as well, using factors such as the education level or the electoral experience of the politicians. Again, quotas didn't affect that, so you're not getting worse candidates. Some research has looked at implementation of quotas in Norway, finding that your firm board members or board members of companies, directors and so forth, are still equally qualified. And then we see a lot that shows that candidate quality goes up as well. So Besley, this paper is quite a seminal one. It looked at Swedish politicians and it's published in one of the best economic journals in the world. And it finds that more competent men and women are selected after you have quotas. I think the title is quite interesting. It's called The Crisis of the Mediocre Men or something like that.
Mediocre male.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
There we go.
We've all seen them.
I'm not going to say anything. There's only one man in this room, I realised.
But I'm all in favor of quotas.
You get fewer lower educated men and more higher educated women. This was in Italy. There was more experience of politicians overall. That was in Australia. Studies quite recently done in European Parliament over a long term saw that education levels of these parliamentary members went up after quotas. In Italian companies, they looked at board of directors, and I could go on. There were some in France as well. I haven't cited everything, but basically the sort of bottom line here is that gender quotas actually are promoting meritocracy if we define meritocracy as selecting the best. So a note here is that we look at meritocracy in terms of selecting who the best person is. That doesn't necessarily mean it would lead to better performance, because a lot of other things can affect whether the most deserving person then is able to deliver a good performance. Because if they get hired in and then everyone else is sort of against them, even if they're the most talented, they might face headwinds. But that being said, there is also research finding that this then results in better economic performance. And it also has a beneficial effect if we're looking at quotas for the number of men. So this is a study from Finland. I don't think our Finnish colleagues are here, but I'll wave the flag a bit. They had actually had
here.
Oh, right, yes, Kia's here. I was thinking of Linda, sorry.
Oh.
Guessing, because Kia, you're very like pan-European. So Finland used to have a 40% quota for men in primary schools. And then after that was lifted, they found that pupil attainment actually dropped. So this was like a reverse analysis. And then they studied these pupils' achievements longitudinally, and they found that by the age of 25, the pupils who had experienced the male teachers who were hired under the 40% quota actually had higher educational attainment and their labor force outcomes. So this is things like being in jobs, level of income was all better as well. So whether the quotas are for women or for men, depending on the industry it is, they seem to work very well, select the best people and result in really good performance. So what we have here is a persistent myth, because we see that people are opposed to quotas, and this tends to be related to their endorsement of meritocracy. So the more they believe in meritocracy, the more opposed they are to selection quotas. We see that Republicans are more likely to oppose quotas for various reasons. So if it's a myth, but it's very deeply rooted in a very entrenched sort of worldview. So the question we have here is, how do we deal with myths when they've got such deep roots? So this is where I'm going to introduce something called attitude roots. So this is a concept that attitude roots, which are psychological factors which are very difficult to change. They can include things like our identity needs, fears, worldview and ideology. So that's meritocracy beliefs is one that I've just cited. And these tend to inform the way we see the world. We tend to look out for things that support our attitude roots, but very crucially, we tend to reject evidence if we feel it's a threat to that underlying attitude root. And so I'll give an example in where we used to study this in the context of misinformed beliefs about vaccination. So here we looked at what drove people's different misconceptions about vaccination, and I just put a couple of examples there on the screen. And it's possible to classify these concerns that people express into clusters, which are then traceable to their attitude roots. So if you kind of imagine that those particular concerns are just sort of like at the surface, what goes on underneath is an attitude root. So on the left, we have one that's called reactance, which is this tendency to push back if we feel like other people are encroaching on our autonomy. And so you can see that all those concerns tend to be about freedoms to do whatever we want to do. Whereas you have on the right side, an attitude root we call distrust, which is basically about, well, lack of trust about vaccinations and what the systems that produce them. So if we apply this to our unmeritocratic quota myth, I can never say that word. I really wish I hadn't gone into this research, almost because I have to pronounce it all the time now. Anyway, we can look at the roots of this specific misconception as being that belief in meritocracy, and that's shaping people's negative attitudes towards gender quotas. So compellingly, if we're going to try and address this misconception, we have to make sure that the evidence we bring in doesn't appear as a threat to the attitude root. So we need to work with the attitude root to change the surface misconception. And a technique we developed to actually achieve this is what we call the empathetic refutational interview. So very briefly, this empathetic refutational interview is a conversation framework. It's designed to help tackle misconceptions around controversial topics, initially with vaccination. And it's a 4-step process, but I'm going to draw out in particular the 2 that are in the middle, because this is key to our intervention for the gender quotas. So the second step here we're focusing on is called affirming the individual. And this is kind of validating and valuing that attitude root. So not endorsing the misconception, but looking at what's below it. So if we're talking about meritocracy, we're looking at, well, can we endorse meritocracy and see what the good points there is in rewarding people for hard work, for example. This is important because that affirmation allows us to pivot to refuting a myth in a way that's staying tailored to that attitude root. So basically, we're trying to reduce the sense of threat that people feel. So this whole process was designed to work with attitude roots and try and build trust to that conversation so that people are more willing to accept the evidence and continue to talk around these issues. So the framework was initially designed to support vaccine conversations, and it tackled misinformation, and it was actually very successful in the field. That's a failure animation, but I think, lead with what was good, right? So we actually had lab studies first looking at how we would do it directly with participants. And these show that participants support clinicians using the empathetic refutation interview approach compared to when they're just giving information. They find it more compelling when information is given to them through an empathetic refutational interview. I'm just going to call it ERI from now, getting tired of saying that. They were also more open to clinicians who were using the ERI, and they felt more trust. And crucially, it did increase their intentions to vaccinate. And we also saw some success in the field where we actually went out and trained GPs to use the ERI, compared that to a control group without it. And it basically helped them increase their patients' vaccine willingness, their hesitant patients' vaccine willingness, and booking vaccine appointments. In fact, it was like 28% more compared to the control group. And it actually became so successful that we had to develop a social enterprise to deal with NHS requests to be trained to use this. That made Steve now a director of a company.
Yes.
So.
Non-executive director.
Which means what you get.
I don't do any work.
Nice place to be. So we now have been branching out to look at where else could this technique apply. And so we've been piloting it on the unmeritocratic quota myth. So I'm going to be summarizing 4 different experiments we did testing the ERI on the unmeritocratic quota myth. And so they used a very similar procedure. So I'll just explain that procedure in one slide here. And we started by targeting the attitude root. And we did this using a screening procedure where first we looked at Republicans. Actually, before that, we did try and just say, let's screen people across the political spectrum. But all the Democrats were not meeting our threshold to be included. So in the end, we just started going, yeah, let's focus and not waste our money. So we got them to complete measures of belief in meritocracy and also measures about their attitudes towards quotas. So remember, we want to look at people who believe in meritocracy and do not like quotas. So once they meet that threshold, they then go into the experiment in the main study, and they read and rate one of 3 conditions. We have a control condition, an ERI condition, and then we try an alternative condition as well, which was either refuting the myth without any of the empathy parts. We even tried presenting them with just with facts about and benefits about quotas. And then at the end of the experiment, they fill in meritocracy beliefs and quota attitude and rate their attitudes towards quotas, so we can see how that's changed from the baseline, which was when they did the screener, which is some time before they went into the experiment. Okay, so I'm going to now go into what we actually did in these 3 conditions. Now, our first 3 studies, we just kind of gave people text that explained the myth, so we were just directly communicating to them. The ERI text would be really going through this process of affirming people and then correcting them. So you can see that we talk about, many people share this idea, society should reward merit, we should hire or promote the most competent person. We could say that rewarding merit is essential in a democratic free market economy. Props to Steve for that line, actually. He knows how the free marketers think. And then we should be concerned. Talk about some people worry that gender quotas are affecting their ability to hire more qualified individuals. So basically just kind of really aligning ourselves with what these concerns of people would be. And then we move into, we pivot towards that refutation, highlighting that gender quotas result in more qualified individuals being selected for a position, and explain some of the evidence that I've just explained to you at the start of this presentation. So there's more text there. But I think crucially, there's this part in the ERI, which is the affirmation of the attitude root. And so we compared this to a very exciting text about the printing press and its history. I mean, some people actually liked it. We had some feedback going, I learned so much about the printing press. That was really exciting. So to each their own. And then in study 1 and 2, we had a text correcting the myth, but without the affirmation. So if you think about getting rid of that red part and just going into the black part below. We even tried a study 3 that was just explaining how quotas benefited representation, and we didn't touch on democratic bits of it. Democratic, meritocratic bits of it. And so these are the results across study 1, 2, and 3, starting with study 1 and 2. There's a very similar pattern of results where you can see that people's opposition to quota goes down after the experiment compared to before. But actually, just refuting also worked. This was interesting for us. We thought we might get some pushback here, but actually we also saw that decrease. And you can see in the control group, when you read about the printing press, nothing's really happening. In study 3, again, we see the same pattern. The quota opposition goes down relative, and this is significant relative to the control. So actually, it seems like if we just make people read about quotas, that can do it, right? Do we actually need the ERI here? Now, one of the problems here is that, of course, when you're in an experiment and you know you're getting paid to do it, you are just going to read what's in front of you and engage with that information. But in real life, how likely are you to go and seek out this attitudinal information? There's a lot of work showing that people tend to ignore it or pay selective attention to information when they're not forced to engage with it. So how do we actually get people to engage with such information in real life? Well, we address this in study 4 because it's through conversation. When you're talking to someone, it's a little bit harder to get away from that discussion. I mean, you can, but then it might create some animosity there if you really, or an argument. So here we had a different setup where participants were reading a conversation. And so we had 2 conversationalists in this conversation. One we call Alex, who is against quotas. So you can see Alex says, well, if you have a quota, you could just end up hiring someone because of their gender and not because they're the best person for the job. And then we've got someone called Sammy who goes, well, and this is the ERI condition. So that he goes, you make a good point. It's actually important to hire the most competent person who applies. Now, in another condition, we had an assertive refutation. So Sammy goes, no, you're wrong about that. You're missing the real problem. We're hiring men who are less skilled. So essentially the content was matched, but the tone of it was just kind of assertive. It wasn't rude, but it was very like, look at the evidence. You've got to continue. So in both cases, the conversation then continues with the refutation of the myth. Of course, a control has a conversation about the printing press, which follows the same structure, same length, wording, readability level. So you can see Sammy is very excited about the printing press here. Okay, so these are the results from the conversation study, and this is the reduction in opposition to quotas. And crucially, you can see the patterns there and it looks the same, but this was the only significant interaction we found relative to the control. So now we're seeing that the ERI has a bit of a bigger effect on reducing people's attitudes to quotas. But another thing I didn't get into so far, which I briefly touched on earlier, was how is that conversation perceived? So sorry, everyone in the room, the header there just says, how do people perceive the conversation? And if you had maybe paid attention to a very throwaway line I gave earlier on, we got people to rate these texts and conversations in the experiment to see, well, how much do you feel it acknowledges the perspective? And how much do they trust this information? How compelling do they find it? How open are they to continuing to hear more about this and engage with this issue? So you can see that there's the ERI is really the best at acknowledging the opposed perspective, so the perspective of the people in the experiment, because remember they were all against quotas. But when this actually made a difference was when the quotas had a personal relevance to that participant. In study 4, we also asked them if they'd had first-hand experience with gender quotas. So this might be examples of whether they worked for or applied for a company that had gender quotas. The qualitative responses to this, actually, we asked them to explain if they said yes or it was quite interesting because some of them just gave responses that just made it seem like they didn't actually have first-hand experience, but thought they did. But so here the issue, so how we're analyzing that is just by whether they reported it yes or no, as opposed to whether they actually did. Because one of the issues is well, whether or not you have personal experience, as long as you perceive that you do, it's going to affect your attitudes. So I'm going to show you the results, and in grey is going to be those who said, yes, I've got experience with quotas, and the one in like whitish grey are the people who said, nope, I've not personally experienced this. And so you can see here, this is a graph showing that acknowledgement of perspective, that the people who reported having first-hand experience were the ones who found that their perspective was most being acknowledged. The ones who were, so it wasn't, the assertive refutation was sort of similar, the control was similar, but it's only in this condition that that personal relevance really became important. And now we look at whether they find that pro-quota response compelling. And again, we see that when there's personal relevance, people start to find it more compelling than if you have an assertive refutation. Similarly for trust. So basically the ERI is working best for people who report that they have had their own perceived first-hand experience with these gender quotas. So I guess overall the take-home messages here is that first, gender quotas actually result in meritocratic outcomes. I spent half the talk actually trying to sell that. Hopefully that's made sense. And then second half of the talk was trying to sell number one to people who really hate quotas. So take-home finding is we can correct that myth. It helps to talk about gender quotas. And if we can get people to engage with that information, they do start to change their minds. But then how do we actually get people to engage? Well, conversation is a good way to do that, because if we just put that information out there online, chances are people will go past it. It won't get shown by the algorithms, or people might dismiss it, but it's harder to do in a conversation. But then when you're having a conversation, you don't want to be in an argument, because nobody really likes to start a conversation if they know it's going to end up in something that makes them feel bad. And arguments they'll never make people feel good. It's even more helpful if you're talking to someone who feels personally affected by the quotas. And I think that's important, because that tends to be cases where people are most negative about them because they feel like they can justify it from their lived experience. So where to next from here then? So obviously that was done in the US, but you know how there's this saying that when the US sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. And we may not be able to do much about the nonsense that's emanating from the White House, but then we sometimes think about, well, how can we in Europe bulk up our defenses against it? And for example, you can see these are headlines here where it's news about companies outside of the US now trying to kind of adapt to avoid that backlash coming from the US. And so we're sort of thinking, well, how can we convince firms to stand firm against these attacks? So I guess some of these are just open questions where we haven't actually gone into the research yet, but I want to leave enough space for further discussion, because the research on this is still very much developmental. And I think that's the most exciting place to be. So we obviously looked at gender quotas, but could we apply this more broadly to equality, diversity, and inclusion initiatives? Of course, we probably need to understand a wider set of attitude roots. I'm happy to take suggestions of anyone who can think about different reasons why people might be opposed. And then, of course, there's an interesting thing we've noticed for this experiment, which is that our original purpose for the ERI was to have a tool for healthcare professionals to speak to patients. Now, when you're in that sort of situation, there tends to be a bit of a hierarchical dynamic, because your health provider knows more, they are the expert in the topic. So how does this translate when we're looking at backlash against EDI? So who can this tool support? Would it be kind of managers talking to employees or prospective employees? There's a bit of hierarchy there. Or are we looking at EDI champions within organizations who often maybe don't have that level of hierarchy and are talking a bit more peer-to-peer to other colleagues who might be opposed? Or if we think about a student context, if we are talking to other students, we don't really have a hierarchy to say, well, I'm the expert and you're not. Although I will note that this experiment actually used peer-to-peer, non-expert, no hierarchical structures in that conversation, which wasn't something we had consciously thought about when we put it together. So I think one thing interesting to explore is, well, what are the different contexts in which we can use this framework? And something we don't quite yet know is how do we initiate the conversation, especially if there's no kind of real hierarchy or reason. Do we have to wait for someone to express the misconception and then jump in, or can it sort of come up if we want to start to talk about it? So yeah, that's kind of the research and where it's going. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Fantastic. It's good to see it all together like that. Very nice.
Stop sharing and have a look at the chat as well, because I think I noticed something.
Yeah, the chat.